Okay, so if you didn't understand the basal ganglia pathways and how Parkinson's, hemibolismus, and Huntington's affected it, I've got you. I mathed it out. But you got to stay with me if you want to understand it. Okay, here we go. Let's start with some arithmetic. A positive times a positive is a positive. A positive times a negative is a negative. And a negative times a negative is a positive. Boom. Okay, so now we can get started. So Parkinson's is going to be characteristically like a decrease in the amount of dopamine that you have. So if you have a lesion coming from the SNC to the putamen, you're going to see decreased activity at the D2 and the D1 receptors. But what does that mean without like getting too mental gymnastics about it? Well, we can math it out. What we're essentially going to do is we're going to take the negative effect times like whatever it is, inhibition or activation, and we're going to add that to the neurotransmitter of the next step. So if we have a negative times a negative, that's going to be a positive impact on the next neurotransmitter. So let's take a positive increase in GABA. That's essentially going to be a positive times a negative, which is going to give us a negative effect on the next neurotransmitter. So now we have a negative times a negative, which is going to give us a positive increase on glutamate in the next step. A positive times a positive is going to give you a positive effect on GABA in the next step. Positive times a negative is going to give you a negative effect on the next step. And a negative times a positive is a negative effect on the cortex. And a negative effect on the cortex is going to look like decreased movement, which is characteristic of Parkinson's. So that was the indirect pathway. What about the direct pathway? Well, if we have a decreased effect on D1, you're going to get a negative times a positive, which is going to be negative. And if you have a negative effect on GABA, you're going to get two negatives, which is going to equal a positive. Boom. The direct and the indirect pathways, they align. And we can see this also with hemibolismus. So we're going to see a lesion at the subthalamic nucleus. So if we have a lesion here, what we're going to see is a decrease in the neurotransmitter that it secretes. So if you have a decrease, a negative, of glutamate, a positive, you're going to get a negative effect on GABA in the next step. If you have a negative effect on GABA, an inhibitory neurotransmitter, you're going to get positive glutamate. And now positive times positive is going to give you positive effect on the cortex, increased movement, which is what you see in hemibolismus. Now finally, we're going to do Huntington's, and I have to give you like a little caveat, some forewarning. We're going to focus on the indirect pathway because that's what Huntington's prefers, and if you try and do it with the D1 pathway, it's going to fall apart, so we're going to ignore that. So there is atrophy of like the caudate and the putamen with Huntington's. So what we're going to see is we're going to see decreased GABA coming from the D2 receptors. So what we're going to see is a negative effect on an inhibitory neurotransmitter. And a negative times a negative is a positive. So now we have a positive effect on a negative neurotransmitter, and a positive times a negative is a negative. Negative times a positive is a negative. A negative times a negative is a positive. A positive times a positive is a positive. Boom, increased movement. Blah, blah, blah. Huntington's. And that's how it all works. And now, so, for example, if we take our exam and someone says, okay, well, there is increased activity at the globus pallidus internus. What effect will that have on movement? Okay, you don't have to go through this whole thing, right? All you need to know is that there was increased activity at GPI. What does GPI secrete? It secretes GABA. If you have increased GABA, what you have to do is you take a positive times a negative, and you think, okay, that's a negative. And if I have a negative times a positive at that next step, what I'll basically see is negative movement in the cortex. Well, negative movement coming from the cortex. And that's how you would solve that on an exam. The end.